Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about Josephine Butler Gray, 1828 to 1906, discussed by Helen Pringle. So thanks so much, Helen, and over to you.
Thanks, Jo. What I'm going to be talking about is a book by Josephine Butler called The Constitution Violated. And Josephine Butler, she's known by Josephine Butler and everybody calls her that, but her birth name was Gray, so Josephine Gray, so that's why I put Gray there. I wish if I put Josephine Gray, I guess no one would know who I was talking about, but anyway. And The Constitution Violated is a book written in the context of the Contagious Diseases Acts in England and globally in the 1860s through to the 1880s and past that globally. The Contagious Diseases Act, and I'll explain what they're about, which will give you a good picture of what Josephine Butler was writing against and for, but they were fundamentally concerned with the regulation of I'm hesitating a bit here because I'll tell you why in a second, but they're fundamentally concerned with the regulation of prostitution around army and navy bases in England and elsewhere globally. But as you'll see with Josephine Butler, she said this isn't about the regulation of prostituted women, or I'm going to use those interchangeably. It isn't about that. It's about the regulation of us all. So one of the things that will come out of the talk, I think, is how when we talk about prostitution, don't let anybody tell you that you can't speak, that only people in prostitution can speak. Obviously, you know, we are lost without having survivors of the prostitution system speak, but we too can speak because this is regulations about prostitution hit us all. And I'm talking about us as women here. So in that context of prostitution, I'll try and explain some of those things that I just mentioned. In that that context of prostitution, I wanted to alert everyone here first that the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Reem Al-Salem, has just put out a call for submissions on prostitution. That's her word. She doesn't use sex work, which is an immediate clue to where she's coming from. Reem Al-Salem is the rapporteur, the special rapporteur for violence against women and girls. She's been there since 2021, and long may she stay there. We spend, I think, a lot of our time being gender critical these days, and I'm speaking for myself and for others as much as it affects them. So much of our time and our energy and our passion is taken up with the immediacy of the threat to us from gender ideology and its proponents. I don't mean to underestimate that reality, and I don't mean to underestimate the gravity and the urgency of that threat, but we've lost a lot of time, and in terms of other questions and issues that we are concerned with and should be concerned with. And the time, I would say, has never looked as auspicious as it does at the moment for addressing the prostitution system. In the context of the European Parliament resolution, which followed on from the 2014 resolutions of the European parliamentary bodies, but also in terms of having Reem Al-Salem as the special rapporteur, and in the light of various changes around the world. So if anybody wants to join us in writing a submission, or just wants to write a short submission of their own, it's 2,000. The maximum is given as 2,000 words, so it's not very long. And even if you just write a little short note, I think quantity as well as the quality of the analysis, if you like, the quantity really counts. It shows support for this question and support for Reem Al-Salem, who is, I would say, perhaps not the most popular person in what is called special procedures at the UN, which includes the rapporteurs and also the independent experts. So that's just a little bit of a thing I'm throwing in because it has to do with what I'm talking about today. about 2 books ago, I talked about John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill, and I just note again that Mill in his later years was involved in 2 large popular campaigns. One was in favour of women's suffrage, the vote, and the other was against the Contagious Diseases Acts. Very little scholarly attention has been given to Mill's stance on prostitution or his opposition to the Contagious Diseases Acts. And there are some really dumb things said about Mill and the contagious diseases, the CEDAW, I'll call it. We could be forgiven for thinking, for example, how good it was that there are women opposed to the acts at all. But that, of course, we all know, in inverted commas, it was because the little ladies who opposed prostitution were religious Puritans who had a moral or a moralistic opposition to the institution. That's not the case with Mill. It's not the case with Harriet Taylor, and it's not the case with Josephine Butler. Josephine Butler was a religious person, although she had a very complicated, I would say, relation to established religion. But I don't think, and certainly she didn't say, that religion was the basis of her opposition to prostitution and its regulation by the state. In fact, it's a very incomplete, if not completely false picture to say of the women's movements in the late 19th century and early 20th century that they were opposed to prostitution because of some questions about disease, about diseased persons and bodies and so forth, and about the immorality in religious terms of prostitution. I'm not saying it's wrong to have that opposition to prostitution. There are many things to be against prostitution for, and many grounds on which one can be opposed to prostitution, but it's not my ground, and I think it's not a ground that we will ever, if I could put it as crudely as this, that we will ever win. We will never win the abolition of prostitution if we confine our protests to religious grounds. So although, as I say, although Josephine Butler was counted herself as a religious person, in many ways, that wasn't the basis on which she argued against prostitution. If we look closely at the opposition by women to the Contagious Diseases Acts, there was a principled opposition to prostitution and its regulation by the Contagious Diseases Acts in terms of analysis of prostitution as a systemic and systematic violation of the principle of personal liberty and as a discriminatory abridgment of the security of that principle. So this is one of the first things that I'd say, is that a lot of campaigns these days in terms of pornography, prostitution and so forth are put in terms of public health campaigns. So I know that a number of people who I've worked with in the past and still count among colleagues and friends, for example, refer to pornography as a public health issue, as an urgent public health issue. It may well be, but that's not my position against it. And in the case of Josephine Butler, it was not her view that prostitution was primarily an issue about health. Obviously, she was very concerned about the health of women in prostitution, and in fact, she devoted much of her time and money to caring for women who prostitution had literally killed or would literally kill in the sense of their health. But her primary aim was to cast, and her primary achievement, I would say, was to cast prostitution as a political issue, that it was an issue which affected the constitution of the state, and that was the main line upon which she argued. It was the basis of her opposition, both in terms of what she wrote and in terms of what she organised, which was after a time, the International Abolitionist Federation. I won't talk about her organisational efforts in relation to prostitution, but she was the head of 2 very important organisations, and the International Abolitionist Federation, particularly in its links with France, was one of the things that France called upon in constructing its program of taking steps towards the abolition of prostitution under a person who's now retired as the Minister for Women. But I think it's really important to grow those that international aspect of the movement against prostitution again. It's not something, abolition can't work in one country alone. It's better than nothing, but it needs to be an international movement of women. What Josephine Butler did that was so extraordinary, whether then or now, was to tie the analysis of prostitution to the foundation of the state, to talk about it as a constitutional issue and as an unconstitutional issue. So the book I'm going to address is called The Constitution Violated, which was published in 1871. And on the third slide, which is not the second one, sorry, Joe, on the third slide, there's a URL for The Constitution Violated, which is an essay by the author of the memoir of John Gray, that's her father, and it's dedicated to the working men and women of Great Britain. Published in 1871, following the Royal Commission, the commission into the Contagious Diseases Acts. It's a coherent and an innovative argument. It's not, by coherent argument, I don't mean that it makes sense. I mean that it's not just a series of opinions. It's a well-worked out argument that I think should be taught in political philosophy, political theory classes at university, along with Marx and Freud and whoever else that we usually teach, going back to Plato and Aristotle and so forth. It has an emphasis on a conception of full citizenship and a commitment to an equal exercise of the privileges and bearing of the burdens of citizenship. So what I'm first going to do is to sketch the background or the context of the Contagious Diseases Acts. I'm sorry, up till this point, you might be wondering what they are and where they came from and where they ended up and so forth. And I'll mention the Royal Commission upon the operation and administration of the Acts, which heard evidence in 1871, the same year that the Constitution Violated was published in the wake of. I'll draw out its central threads and assumptions as to the legitimacy, the Commission's central threads and assumptions as to the legitimacy of the state's licensing of prostitution. And then I'll address Butler's framing of the prostitution of women, not as an issue of individual freedom or of choice or of health and hygiene and so forth, but rather as a question of justice. Between 1869 and 1886, so while this book was published, Butler was the leader of the Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts and a founder later of the International Abolitionist Federation, as I mentioned. So first of all, to talk about prostitution and the Contagious Diseases Acts and the British Army. The context within which Butler explored the question of prostitution was the debate over the Contagious Diseases Acts after 1869. Many male writers about this time and about Butler and about Mill, for example, fall rather easily into the common stereotype of Victorian moralism expressing itself in the language of sex and purity, in the way in which the work of the historian W.E.H. Lecky did, for example, L-E-C-K-Y. Lecky wrote a notorious and much quoted passage in his 2-volume work. He wrote about, and he expressed, I think, a view of prostitution which was very common at that time, and I would have to say it remains very common, even though it's not usually put in quite these terms. Lecky writes, he says, "I'm going to write about the mournful figure of that unhappy being whose very name is ashamed to speak." What he talked about of prostitutes, as he called them. He said, "The woman who is a prostitute is herself the supreme type of vice, but she is ultimately the most efficient guardian of virtue. Except for her, the unchallenged purity of countless rather happy homes would be polluted, and not a few who, in the pride of their untempted chastity, think of her with an indignant shudder, would have known the agony of remorse and despair." In other words, what he's saying here is that the prostitute looks like a terrible figure of vice as distinct from virtue, but in fact she safeguards the virtue of all the other women and of the household. It's a shameful picture, but I think it's still a story, I think, that some people even still tell themselves to these days. And one of the ways in which they tell it is that they say, if we didn't have prostitution, there would be much higher rates of sexual assault. If we didn't have prostitution, there would be the men who men would rape women, as if they say that as if women in prostitution aren't women at all. They're something else, objects. And what they mean by that is that prostitution acts like a sort of safety valve for the virtue of the good women, the wife and the mother, the faithful wife and the faithful mother, for example, the chaste woman. And as long as men have this outlet for their whatever it is about them, then the rest of women are safe. So we should look at what he's saying is we should look at prostitutes in his term rather like the holy harlots. They do this task that nobody else can be found to do, which is to protect everybody, protect all the other women, and so we should be grateful to them. There's that picture of the holy harlot really sort of reflects again the necessity and the inevitability of prostitution. Not merely that it's existed forever, but that there was a good reason that it existed forever. In that context, so he wrote that just in the 1860s in the context of debates about questions of prostitution. The Contagious Diseases Acts were designed to address the problem of the sexual health, or were said, rather, to address the problem of the sexual health and hygiene of the British Army and Navy, the Royal Navy, in and around the garrison towns and ports. I've just made up the second slide, which is, you might remember from Pride and Prejudice, when I think it's Lydia, who's the youngest Bennet daughter, makes off with Mr. Wickham, who abducts her and takes her off to one of these zones that the army and that the military inhabited around Britain. There are about 16 of them, I think, and they extended about 10 miles outside of the actual encampments of the military. You can see the unscrupulous Mr. Wickham in that way. In all, 4 acts were passed by the British Parliament, respectively in 1864, 1866, 1868, and in 1869. What's also significant and what's often forgotten is that similar acts were passed by the British Parliament, were enacted throughout the Empire. For example, the 1864 Cantonments Act and the 1868 Contagious Diseases Act in India. In Australia, there were similar passages of legislation. Colonial precedents were in fact important for British domestic laws. So, and some historians argue that it's important to understand the British Acts, the Contagious Diseases Acts, in the wider imperial context of the regulation of prostitution. The repeal of the British Acts was finally done in 1886 and was achieved after the efforts of an organised opposition emerging around the late 1860s, led by women's groups whose prominent figures included Butler, as well as Harriet Martineau, Florence Nightingale, and they organised newspaper campaigns, parliamentary petitions, large public meetings. They couldn't vote, of course, and various other sorts of ways of opposition. When Josephine Butler heard about the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts in England, she wrote this. She said, "I feel inclined to do as Oliver Cromwell did when he saw poor King Charles lying dead. Cromwell just took hold of the head of King Charles and shook it a little." This is in 1642, whatever. Later, she said, Cromwell just took hold of the head of Charles the First, shook it a little to be quite sure that it was loose from the body. And she felt rather strongly about this question. Even at that stage, I think people in England still didn't really talk about the death of the execution of King Charles I. They didn't talk about his execution in quite so happy terms, if you like. It simply wasn't done. Many people at that time still called King Charles a martyr. When the Contagious Diseases Acts were passed in the 1860s, it was widely thought that around 1/3 of the military defenders of the empire had contracted venereal disease. And the most common explanation was that this had come about through the intercourse of soldiers and sailors with what were called prostitutes. To address that problem, as it was framed in 1864, designated doctors were tasked to examine any prostituted woman, actually any woman suspected of being a prostituted woman with venereal disease, after which she could be detained in a lock hospital, which is a kind of detention centre, for up to 3 months, and if found to be infected for longer, and she could be detained in the lock hospital with no right of appeal or recourse to habeas corpus, no trial, no nothing. And you'll find that the notion of the importance of habeas corpus is emphasised by Josephine Butler. The 1866 Act, the third of the Acts, second of the Acts rather, further set up a force of what were called medical police to patrol the stipulated areas and to require any suspected woman, so they could just be stopped on suspicion of being a prostitute and on suspicion of having venereal disease, any suspected woman to have fortnightly genital inspections for a period of up to a year after that. I think sometimes when you sort of think about inspections in that way, people can lose a sense of how invasive, how humiliating, and how painful these genital inspections were. Josephine Butler called them steel rape. Sometimes she called them steel rape or surgical rape. And she meant it in every sense, literally, I think, in terms of its painfulness, its humiliatingness, its lack of consent, every kind of criterion that we talk about when we talk about rape came into her view of what these genital inspections were involved. She talked about how the body of a woman could be entered in this way without any kind of without any agreement on her part at all, and in fact that qualified as a form of steel rape. Other women took up that phrase as well. One of the things that strikes you about when you read the Constitution violated is what I would say. I wouldn't use this term, and I don't think anybody here listening would use this term either, but was what you might say was the indelicacy of Josephine Butler's language. By indelicacy here, and I don't mean that in any sense as a criticism, but by indelicacy I mean that her language, the way that she talked about this problem, the way she approached it, was considered to be indelicate and unladylike at the time. It wasn't fitting for a woman to speak like this, but she did anyway. So the Act of 1869 also compelled, the last of the acts, compelled prostituted women to be registered and to carry official registration cards. The acts all involved the surveillance and supervision of prostituted women, or again, more accurately, of women about whom the police had a suspicion on that account. In other words, and Josephine Butler points this out, every single woman was subject to the strictures of these acts. The acts didn't simply apply to prostituted women, because any woman could be suspected of VD and of being a prostitute, and they could be apprehended on the sole suspicion of one man and subjected to medical violence, as she also called it. She had a very vivid sense of the ways in which doctors could perform the violent work of the state. That way, there was no similar surveillance of either military or civilian men, and in fact, as Josephine Butler herself pointed out, in the acts there was no the acts didn't actually refer to, even though they were said to have been invented in order to deal with military men, in fact, there was no reference to that as the as the motor of the acts. So she points out in Constitution Violated that you would expect these acts to have a kind of preamble which said, in light of the disease and prevalence of venereal disease amongst military men, but they didn't have that at all. And this points to her view that these acts were not simply directed at the practice of prostitution, but they were directed more generally at a form of control over the population, and in particular, control of the population through the control and surveillance of women. Sometimes I think we use those terms surveillance too lightly, too broadly, but in fact that was the term that people used at the time, both for and against the acts. They talked about it as a form of surveillance. And obviously as a form of control, of surveillance control. Another term that was often used at the time was espionage. In other words, that the surveillance over women was a form of espionage. And so, for example, as I'll mention in a minute, when the Royal Commission into the Acts came into play, they actually talked about they would, if a witness at the Commission said, well, we should apply surveillance to men as well, the members of the Commission said things like, you can't really be suggesting that we should have espionage of the men as of the men who visit prostitutes as well. And so they often use those terms. They're not my terms, espionage and surveillance of this. So what the Acts did was to set up a very complicated and very arbitrary, or could be very arbitrary, basis for surveillance and supervision of women in general and of the population more broadly as well. In 1870, and leading on to 1871, the British Acts were the subject of review by a Royal Commission. The Royal Commission was composed of 23 men, no women, including members of Parliament, clergy and scientists. The modern philosopher Jeremy Waldron, who's actually quite a decent sort of fellow, usually describes the acts which were the subject of the Commission proceedings in these terms. He described in very favourable terms, or I would say idiotic terms. He said, there is no doubt that the measures of the Contagious Diseases Acts were well intended. They were part of a general progressive movement to, I'm sorry, I can't say this without laughing, but I mean, he's obviously saying this in very seriously. He says the Contagious Diseases Acts were well intended. They were part of a general progressive movement to improve health and hygiene in British society, as well as the armed forces, allowing the practice of medicine to play a larger role in public policy making. Honestly, the opposition of women like Josephine Butler was developed and voiced publicly within the context of an organised movement of women opponents and of men. First of all, an association had been set up of men against the Contagious Diseases Acts, and then that was transmuted into a movement of women opponents. Although that movement of women is frequently portrayed as a wowzerish social purity movement, which is a portrait pioneered in particular by the historian Judith Wolkowitz, who you should avoid reading. She doesn't say anything useful. Their position was formulated in protest against male sexual violence rather than as a defence of women's sexual purity. So don't let anybody tell you that that the women who were opposed to the Contagious Diseases Act and to prostitution in general were about the purity of women. They were actually opposed to male sexual license, and I'll explain what they meant by that in a second. The Royal Commission proceeded on the basis that prostitutes, as they put it, as the term they used, were responsible for the spread of venereal disease, and hence for the weakening of the defence of the realm through the effects of VD on the health of its defenders. Throughout the hearing of evidence, as well as in its final report in 1871, the Commission did not consider at any time that the category of prostitutes might include men. So men didn't come into the picture, and nor did it focus at all on the male buyers of sex, what we would call the buyers. The This explicit gendering of the problem of transmission of venereal disease through prostitution was for the most part taken as a given by the supporters of the Acts, but was one of the chief criticisms raised in the evidence given by its opponents, like Josephine Butler. The 1871 report of the Commission noted this aspect of the evidence offered, and they dismissed any such concerns as they had throughout the hearing of evidence. So they said and this is a rather well-noted passage from the Royal Commission's report, Volume 1, they said, many witnesses have urged that as well as on grounds of justice as on expediency, soldiers and sailors should be subjected to regular examinations as well. We may, and the Commission said, we may at once dispose of this recommendation, so far as it is founded on the principle of putting both parties to the sin of fornication on the same footing, and we're going to rebut that suggestion that the users and the women are on the same footing, but they say, because we'll mention the obvious but not less conclusive reply, that there is no comparison to be made between prostitutes and the men who consort with them. So it doesn't actually say they buy them, it says they consort with them. It's men consorting as they do. With the one sex, the Commission said, with the one sex, the offence is committed as a matter of gain, and that's with women. With the other sex, men, it's an irregular indulgence of a natural impulse. And who can blame them? These men. That inequality in sexual footing, as they put it, in terms of footing, was simply dismissed as natural. The irregular indulgence of a natural impulse was what men's consorting with women is about. John Stuart Mill gave evidence to the Royal Commission in May 1871, and he set out the foundation of his opposition to the Acts as a matter of principle and not, say, in terms of their abuses or individual effects. He, for example, said, I don't consider the Acts justifiable on principle because it appears to me to be opposed to one of the greatest principles of legislation, the security of personal liberty. It appears to me that the legislation of this sort takes away the security of personal liberty almost entirely from a particular class of women intentionally, but incidentally and unintentionally, one may say, from all women, because inasmuch as it enables a woman to be apprehended by the police on suspicion and taken before a magistrate, and then by that magistrate she's liable to be confined for a term of imprisonment, which may amount to 6 months, a year actually, by refusing to sign a declaration consenting to be examined. So if you, as a woman, you refuse to be consented to be examined, to be still raped, then you would be detained for a further period until. And that's part of Josephine Butler's protest as well. That's part of her claim against the Contagious Diseases Act as well, that it is that this is a violation of the security of personal liberty, or sometimes she talked about a violation of the principle of personal security. In other words, and it was a discriminatory violation that men were never examined. There was no mention of, as I said, of men as prostituted, but there was no, it struck the Commission as completely ludicrous to even propose that men should be examined as well as women. Men still hold that view. You can find in cases of assault and sexual assault in brothels today in Australia, for example. I'm sure you can find them elsewhere as well, of men who claim that they should not have to undergo any kind of examination in order to consort with women. I'm going to take up that word consort from now on and just talk about that's what prostitution involves. The law, but it was fundamentally and at its heart a discriminatory imposition on personal security. The law was one-sided. It was inflicted on women by men. It delivered over a large body of women intentionally and many other women unintentionally, because they could be arrested on suspicion, to insulting indignity at the pleasure of the police and of the doctors. Don't think for a moment that doctors were or are necessarily men who took no pleasure in their part in these examinations. I mean, I think one of the things that comes up very strongly in Josephine Butler's work throughout, and her work on medicine more generally, on medical men, is the way in which gynecology was something that men took a particular interest in for not entirely scientific reasons, if I could put it like that. I don't mean to tar every doctor with the same brush, obviously, but there was certainly, in Australia, medical men, for example, took great delight in treating Aboriginal women, Indigenous women in Australia in certain ways. And they pretended that they were scientific. Sorry, getting back to Josephine Butler. In fact, the Contagious Diseases Act instituted a state, Josephine Butler said, with the genuine characteristics of tyranny. And she was very concerned at how the British state or the English state was sliding towards tyranny and away from a condition of genuine respect for the principle of personal liberty. In fact, the Acts, this line of argument that Josephine Butler proposed made use of themes in regard to civil life, primarily, such as the security of the liberty of the subject and the discriminatory violation of that liberty as raising the spectre of tyranny. So her analysis is not tied to a gender-neutral conception of fairness, but to a consideration of the gendered assumptions, or not to a gender-neutral conception of justice, but to a consideration of the gendered assumptions that the Contagious Diseases Act reflected, and which they also constructed and buttressed. So it wasn't just that they reflected discrimination in other parts of society, but they were part of the discrimination. I would draw out of Butler's analysis that she sees the Contagious Diseases Acts and their system of espionage and surveillance as part of the institution of prostitution. In other words, they weren't simply a regulation of the practices of prostitution or of acts of prostitution. Rather, they were formed the state licensing system for prostitution. It was similar to what was operating in France at the time, which would be subject to similar criticisms as the Contagious Diseases Act. And if you think state licensing and state regulation of prostitution has ended, come to New South Wales. This is a state that I live in. It's considered to be one of the models for decriminalisation of prostitution, both in Australia and the world. But in fact, the system of regulation and licensing is an essential part of a system of prostitution that presents itself as decriminalised. That's what sex workers' work involves, that you would try to regulate prostitution in ways that would assimilate it to non-similar forms of work. Any regulation by the state actually acts as a license to the vice of prostitution. So we can't say, well, that was the Contagious Diseases Act in the 1900s, in the 19th century rather, but things have changed now. It's and I think this is the point of Kat Banyard's book, The Pimp State, is that any system of the regulation of prostitution involves the state as a pimp, as acting the part of the pimp. It acts as a license to the vice of prostitution. The state's provisions of securities for prostitution, for the protection of prostitution, licenses the availability of women and clean women, such that the state acts and stands in the role of the pimp, like the panda state, you could call it, or the pimp state, whereby the state acts as a procurer in raising an army of prostitutes alongside the general army as well, and to serve the purposes of at that time the official standing army of men. Beyond that historical context, the state acts so as to license a form of, not only to license the setup of the setup of prostitution rather, but also it acts to give a license, a kind of permission to a form of male sexuality that is presumed to be natural, the irregular satisfaction of a natural impulse. So rather like a driver's license today, it's kind of, here's your permission slip. This is your license. You don't have to use it. You only have to, you just have to have it with you. It's always there. It always allows you to do your worst. It's your man's license, the male license. So the elements here that in terms of licensing, and I think licensing is such a good word there because it has these different meanings. The license of giving free rein to things, but also giving a permission, like a written permission, or a written permission and sometimes unwritten permissions as well, to do certain things on the basis of what your sex is. The elements here are that these acts, the Contagious Diseases Acts, as Josephine Butler points out, were not really about questions of health and sickness and disease at all, which was the framework that the Commission members were eager to bring home to all of those who gave evidence to the Commission. The regulation by the Contagious Diseases Acts of this disease and this venereal disease alone invoked questions of subordination and the naturalization of subordination, making subordination natural as simply a fixed feature of the sexual landscape. Prostitution falls on women as a penalty of sex, as a penalty of their sex, who are then made to pay like a super tax because the acts that position women's desires in terms of responsibility for the existence of prostitution and of prostitutes, and place a certain type of women as beneficiaries of prostitution. What I mean by that is that we should really be so offended and so outraged by the way in which women are made to feel that their safety, their integrity, their dignity, that women who are not in prostitution are made to take a position that they should be grateful to women in the prostitution system because they have paid the price for our safety. Of course, just because they've paid the price doesn't mean that we actually are safe. That wouldn't be, that would never happen. But nevertheless, women are positioned in that sense, made to feel, and I don't mean made to feel in that sort of sense of he made me feel this. I mean, we are put in a position, a sentimental position, or a position of feeling in which we should be, we are required to be grateful for the price that others have paid for other women have paid for our safety and comfort. So what state regulation of prostitution becomes, and I think we should all be outraged by that. How can we bear to be in that position? It's not a position that we asked to be in. It's not a position that we ever sort of thought would be a good idea to be in, I don't think, for the most part, but nevertheless, it's the position that we're put in regardless of what we want. So what state regulation of prostitution becomes is a form of licensing and protection of practices of inequality. What appears to follow from this understanding is that the Contagious Diseases and Acts themselves form part of the institution of prostitution, with the state acting as a pimp and procurer. Josephine Butler's criticism of the state regulation of prostitution centred on their discriminatory impact on the personal liberty of women and their licence that they gave to the sexual liberty of men. So the acts don't, as Butler pointed out so acutely, I think, these are not merely acts. The acts were not merely measures to deal with the army and the navy. They were measures to deal with the civilian population, the whole population, and their license to the sexual liberty of men. So the acts don't simply reflect, but establish a gendered hierarchy that allocates sexual prowess to the one end, to the one sex, and chastity plus vulnerability to the other. That's us, women. All presented and dressed up to look natural, as if what could be more natural, made up to look natural, and to look natural not only to the men who benefited from it, but to women as well, who we take for granted that that's what and women still repeat that. I know so many women who still will tell you that prostitution is inevitable. In other words, natural. The gendered social hierarchy of domination and subordination rests on and performs itself through the licensing of the unruliness of man's desire. To say that's just how men are, so we'll license it. We'll give them a license, the basis of prostitution. And just as it places some women as under inevitable suspicion, it puts other women in the position of safety from the unruly sexuality of men. That general line of argument here is that prostitution is not a profession that's chosen by individual women, but a social institution, a part of which is the very law that regulates it. So it's not that you have the system of prostitution and the system of regulation and licensing outside of it. The system of prostitution includes, the prostitution system includes the licensing and the regulation. It's a system that deserves injustice to be swept away at its basis, because it's not simply a series of discrete harms by individuals who consort with other individuals, but as Butler points out, it's a violation of the central principle of legislation and of justice itself, the principle of personal liberty secured in its equal enjoyment. So for her, the institution of prostitution involves a gendered inferiority assigned to one class of people considered subordinate relative to another class of people who are considered to be in the rightful possession and exercise of sexual prowess. If I can put it very crudely, they are licensed, men are licensed to consort. In other words, they are licensed to fuck. To summarize, prostitution in this view is a form of inequality that has no connection at all, or little connection, if any, to natural differences, whatever they might be. As an institution and as a set of individual practices both, it's a hierarchy that is constructed, fostered and protected by law in both its punitive aspects, steal, rape, and its educative aspects. By educative, I mean prostitution is a pedagogical institution. It teaches us, everyone in a society, lessons about who we are and who we're not. It sets up, and here's where I'm going to finish in terms of what it sets up for Josephine Butler. It sets up a constitutional framework within which people lead their lives, form their desires and make their choices. It's not just a part of our cultural institutions or whatever, our entertainment institutions in that way, but as some have called it, but it's actually part of the constitutional framework of a society. It's that deep, within which people lead their lives, they form their desires and make their choices. It's a kind of form of sentimental education that teaches women and men about their desires and their propensities. The use of law to license prostitution, law and laws, was a violation of this central principle. For Butler, was a violation of the central principle of legislation itself, the security of personal liberty. So this is the point where Josephine Butler went further, though, and this is what I want to finish with. For her, this is not only a question about laws and legislation, but about the British Constitution. I would say at the beginning, I know that a lot of people say that the United Kingdom does not have a constitution. What they mean by this is that it doesn't have a written constitution. Every state has a constitution. It's its makeup, what makes it what it is. Even when the British Constitution doesn't have a written constitution, it actually does have a written constitution. When people say that, although not in a single document like the US Constitution with its various amendments, but in every state, in every country, even those with a written constitution or a basic law, like the Grundgesetz in Germany, there is more to its constitution than written documents. I'm a political scientist by trade, and this is a bit of an obsession of mine, but I'll save you from that for now, is that every state, the shape of a state is its constitution, the ground rules, the basic law. So in England, people often used to talk about the ancient constitution. And what they meant by the ancient constitution, very few people still do, but what they meant by the ancient constitution was the foundation of the British state. And what they meant was the fundamental building blocks of the system of government, but also of politics and of social and cultural rules and guidelines. Josephine Butler isolates one principle of that constitution that's foundational, which is personal security. And what she does is to argue that prostitution as an institution, tied up with its regulation by the state, undermines the very basic principle of the ancient constitution, which she argues that we should beat a return to. We should go back to the ancient constitution, see what principles are there, and then resist the changes on the basis of that. I'll just finish with that. Butler quoted from Lord Chatham to argue that Magna Carta, the Petition of Rights, and the Bill of Rights form that code which is called the Bible of the English Constitution, the basic law. The present state of dealing with that code, she says, was reducing, in particular, English working men and women from being free, reducing them from a state of being free to a state of slavery. If you remember, she had been involved also in the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and its incidents. She says, the object, in terms of the Constitution violated, she says, the object of the Constitution violated, that book, is to set forth the unconstitutional nature of certain recent acts of the legislature and the danger arising therefrom, with the view of arousing this country to a sense of that danger. In other words, she identifies the Contagious Diseases Act as in breach of the Constitution, as unconstitutional, as out of whack with the basic principles of the ancient Constitution. The acts, she says, reduce women to the status of slavery. She says these acts virtually introduce a species of villanage or slavery. And she continues, I use the word not sentimentally, but in the strictest legal sense. I use the word slavery in the strictest legal sense. It means that condition in which an individual is not master of his own person. And the condition of slavery is defined, she says, in Magna Carta by the omission of all slaves from the rights which that charter grants to everyone else. And concludes, she says, there could be no more complete, galling and oppressive deprivation of freedom than that which takes place under these acts. So again, there's that sense what she's saying is prostitution is a political institution protected by political instruments, by law, by laws made by a legislature. It's not an outcome of some natural something or other in that way, but it's a political institution, and the resistance to it needs, which is the word she uses, resistance, needs to take a political form as well. She talks about this, what has happened here, as a crisis in the Constitution of England. She says this is a crisis as great as any crisis through which this nation has ever passed. This country, she says, was once called upon to decide whether it would permit the king for his satisfaction to override the 39th clause of Magna Carta, which deals with right to trial by jury for those who are accused of something, and it decided most emphatically that he should not. Our country is now called on to decide whether it will permit Parliament itself, for the sake of the lusts of certain men, to override this same clause, this same guarantee of personal security. So what she argues for on that basis, I'm sorry, I've run out of time. I'd have to give you volume 2 of Josephine Butler at some point, but she talks about the path of return to the ancient constitution, which is a path of resistance. When she speaks, she later says in another work of hers that finally the slave speaks, that finally the slave, who are preeminently women in the setup of this constitution, they are now speaking, and they are now speaking loudly about the importance of a political resistance to a state of tyranny on the one hand and of slavery on another. They're not words that people should throw around lightly, slavery and tyranny, and I think she knows that and uses them very carefully in that respect, to urge upon us all that path of resistance. And I guess that's the conclusion that I'd reached is, ladies, resist. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen.
That's good.
We've got a couple of minutes left, but I think it was a brilliant discussion, so let's leave it there, and we'll invite you back to do more Josephine Butler, if possible.
Oh, I'd love to.
Great.
I would say that if you get a chance to read Josephine Butler, she is so you feel so strong when you read her. You know that you can't read her work without feeling I don't like the word empowered because of the way that it's used and misused, but geez, I feel so empowered when I read her. You know, I feel so strong and as if, you know, we when we draw on the women who've come before us, we gain so much that we don't if we just by ourselves.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Helen. And there's breakout rooms for those who could go to them. And otherwise, next week, we have got the Dale Spender book coming up. So there's always been a women's movement in the 20th century, 1983 by Dale Spender and discussed by Dorothea Annison. So hopefully see you next week or in the breakout rooms. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. It's a privilege to speak to everyone here.